The next item of business is debate on motion 20318 in the name of Michael Russell on European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate press the request to speak buttons now, please? And can I tell you that time is tight in this debate, so I don't have the capacity to give extra time for interventions. I call on Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion for up to 12 minutes. Please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all thank both the Finance and Constitution Committee and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for their speedy work on this LCM, which has been necessitated by the timetable set at Westminster and the Scottish Government's desire to ensure that the House of Commons is aware of the Scottish Parliament's view of this bill prior to the conclusion of its stages in that chamber. I note the report from the Finance and Constitution Committee, which has just come to hand, and the conclusion of that report, which is that the committee recommends that the Scottish Parliament does not consent to the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, a conclusion dissented from by Adam Tompkins, Murdo Fraser and Alexander Burnett. I also note the other issues raised, including a request by the committee that both governments, the UK Government and the Scottish Government, give their views on the changes that are required to the Seoul Convention. I'm very happy to do so. I've done so repeatedly to UK ministers. They have never come back to me on that matter, so it will be illuminating to know if there is a view from the UK Government and how it could be taken forward. I also note the observations of the DPLR Committee with regard to the issues of scrutiny, the exercise of joint powers, the programming of secondary and other Brexit legislation, the ability of UK ministers to legislate in devolved areas, and the use of the affirmative procedure. I'll respond to each of those issues in more detail in writing, but I'm in broad agreement with the committee on all of these matters and keen to work with them to ensure there is effective scrutiny. To that end, there is discussion underway about a new protocol between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, and I hope the UK Government, even at this late stage, will recognise the need to be part of that process. Presiding Officer, last month, Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party suffered a heavy defeat in Scotland. The Tories lost more than half their MPs. They now have barely 10% of Scottish Westminster seats. Their Brexit plans were roundly rejected by the people of Scotland. Indeed, around 75% of voters in Scotland supported parties who either want to remain in the EU or support a second EU referendum. Moreover, that result followed on the EU referendum in 2016, the UK election in 2017 and the European election last year, all of which sent that unambiguous message. Scotland wants to remain in the European Union. That message has been relayed time and time again. That message to the Prime Minister is clear today, as it was yesterday, and will be tomorrow. Let me put it this way. Prime Minister, we said no to Brexit, and we mean it. But, Presiding Officer, the Prime Minister is not listening to the Scottish people, just as his party in Scotland, as we hear, is not listening. Because in 3 weeks' time, it is virtually certain that Scotland will be taken out of the European Union against our will. And we will, each of us, be forcibly stripped of our European citizenship against our specific wishes. That is an intolerable situation. And this Parliament, as the voice of Scotland, must say so. So at the outset of this debate this afternoon, I urge this Parliament, all of this Parliament, to refuse consent to the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, and in so doing to say we do not consent to being forced out of the EU. Presiding Officer, the European Union is founded on values: democracy, equality, human dignity, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. It has rolled back barriers to travel, to work, to study and trade across our continent. It has eased the movement of goods and workers, allowed the integration of supply chains, and set standards of protection for the environment and workers' rights. Perhaps above all, it has been the guarantor of peace and prosperity across Europe for over 5 decades. Why should we consent to a process that removes Scotland from this project, strips people in Scotland of their rights, and that will cost jobs and living standards, all against our will? This is a sad moment in the history of Scotland and the United Kingdom. A moment at odds with the outward-looking and internationalist values so many of us, right across the UK, hold dear. The Withdrawal Agreement Bill is a vehicle for implementing in domestic law this disastrous process. The Withdrawal Agreement, which is contained in it and amplified by it, is deeply damaging to the UK, as the Scottish Government has set out in detail before. But it is particularly bad for Scotland, as all the evidence shows, and it is uniquely offensive to Scottish democracy. For Presiding Officer, England and Wales voted to leave and are leaving. Northern Ireland will have its own arrangements for closer alignment and the right to decide their own future. Scotland, alone of the 4 nations, voted Remain but is being forced to leave with no special arrangements or say over its future relationship with the European Union. It is therefore axiomatic that any Scottish Government must recommend to any Scottish Parliament that it refuses consent for something of such massive significance and consequence to be done to us, which the Scottish people to whom we report have clearly, consistently and specifically rejected. I believe that argument on its own should be enough for all of us this afternoon to refuse consent to the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. But there are other strong reasons for doing so. This bill is in its third iteration. It was first developed to implement the May deal, further redrafted to implement the Johnston deal, and then revised to reflect the manifesto in which the Tories stood in December, a manifesto rejected by Scotland. In each iteration, it has weakened parliamentary and devolved administration scrutiny and involvement, further undermined the rights of citizens and society, and strengthened an already overbearing executive. In addition, the bill puts a no-deal Brexit firmly back on the table by the reckless and irresponsible determination of the UK government to legislate to prohibit itself from seeking any extension to the implementation period. During the bill's second reading in the Commons, Keir Starmer referred to the UK government's prohibition on extending the implementation period as reckless and ridiculous, and I echo those sentiments. It's no secret, presiding officer, that like Scotland, this Scottish government is opposed to Brexit. But if it is to happen, we must do everything to limit the damage. That should mean the UK remaining in the single market and the customs union. We first argued that case in our Scotland's Place in Europe paper over 3 years ago. We've developed it further during that time. Yet the UK government has contemptuously ignored those proposals whilst bringing forward a close variant of them for Northern Ireland, and is now adding insult to injury by imposing a hard Brexit process and outcome with a completely arbitrary end date for necessary discussion and negotiation. Negotiating a free trade agreement is extremely complex. Attempting to secure a deal between a former member and the EU will be a unique activity. Doing so in under a year, as the President of the Commission has said today in London, is unrealistic, especially if the UK is attempting at the same time to negotiate trade arrangements with the US and other non-EU countries. It is undoubtedly true that only the narrowest and most superficial free trade arrangement could be agreed by the end of 2020. Any deal that avoids that risk to minimise the damage of Brexit would definitely need an extension beyond 2020. Therefore, legislating to rule out an extension does nothing but vastly increase the risk and likelihood of a no-deal exit. The current bill also removes previous provisions safeguarding workers' rights, replaced instead by a potential, though only promised and never seen by anyone, new separate bill. The same weak undertaking is attached to the removal of environmental protections. The Scottish Government has no confidence that the UK Government will maintain existing protections in any area, let alone strengthen them. Why would we believe that people who have spent their entire political lives decrying the high standards agreed in Europe would now lift a finger to maintain them? Of course they won't. They want them gone, usually because they can profit by their removal. And in addition, presiding officer, these proposals on the removal of employment protections cut right across the Scottish Government's commitment to fair work, a commitment which is central to the Scottish Government's economic strategy, a commitment that is good for workers, good for business and good for Scotland. Thus, this decision by the UK Government leaves Scottish workers highly vulnerable to a deterioration in their conditions. But there is, amazingly, a group of people treated even more appallingly by this bill. Those are unaccompanied children seeking asylum. These are amongst the most vulnerable people in the world. Children who have been separated from their parents or any other adult familiar to them. Children who have witnessed horrors we cannot fathom. It is therefore extraordinary, almost inexplicable in its inhumanity, that the UK Government plans to remove and negotiate arrangements to conform with the Dublin III regulation from the EU Withdrawal Act in 2018. That means that the UK Government would no longer be bound to negotiate appropriate agreements with the EU on unifying families and supporting vulnerable children. Instead, the UK Government will merely make a statement of policy towards these children within 2 months. That is not a commitment of any sort. It will not help a single child or stop a single tragedy. How can that be defended by any elected member in this chamber or in any other? Presiding Officer, as I conclude, let me touch briefly on wider migration issues. Scotland's Parliament has a duty to protect the rights and well-being of those EU citizens who have chosen to make Scotland their home. In addition, it's in our interest to continue to attract people from across the EU to visit, study, work and live here in the future. Freedom of movement isn't a burden for Scotland, it's a boon. Its ending is not something we should celebrate, it's something we should condemn. As this Parliament has already agreed, the UK government should not be making EU citizens apply to maintain rights they already have. They should implement in UK law the commitments made to protect EU citizens' rights in the UK as set out in the withdrawal agreement without precondition or unnecessary bureaucracy. There is no reason to tie this agreement to the rest of the deal. While we recognise there is no guarantee the EU would similarly ring-fence UK citizens' rights from the withdrawal agreement, that should not stop the UK government doing the right thing here and now. Nonetheless, I strongly urge EU nationals to apply for and get settled status. I dislike the scheme as much as they do. I'm angry that the UK government have implemented it and last night would not in the House of Commons even accept its many flaws. I want to do more to protect EU nationals who live here and encourage more to come here. But this government can at present only do so by ensuring that the law is observed. The first step, therefore, is to make sure that each citizen has the right to be here according to the law as it now is. We will stand alongside every EU national who has done so, who has that status, and we will protect them in every way we are currently able, while seeking more powers to do so like a normal nation. Presiding Officer, the Withdrawal Agreement Bill is one of the most important pieces of legislation ever considered by the UK Parliament, by this Parliament, and by the National Assembly for Wales. It will involve a fundamental adjustment to the Constitution and has far-reaching implications for everyone, not only on these islands, but across our continent. We cannot approve it because it goes contrary to the wishes of the majority of the people of Scotland. We cannot approve it because there has been no attempt by the UK to involve us in any sort of mutually agreeable process. Indeed, the reverse has been the case for the last 3.5 years. And we cannot approve it because it alters and diminishes the basic rights of so many, including some of our most vulnerable fellow human beings. Presiding Scotland, everyone's views in Scotland are equally valid, those who voted Remain and those who voted to leave. But we have a duty to respect the clear and consistent majority opposition in Scotland to leaving the European Union. This was a bad decision, but we did not take it. This is a bad bill, and we should not approve it. And many of us now recognise that we live under a bad constitutional settlement, which the people of Scotland and no one else have the right to change. But no matter your view on that, today this Parliament has a clear duty to express its opposition both to Brexit and to the approach the bill takes to Brexit. This government therefore has no hesitation in recommending that the Parliament explicitly rejects the request for consent to the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, and I move the motion in my name.
I call